physics-based enemies, procedural animations, things that everyone likes to see in a video game. I mean, just the idea of enemies being able to react in a realistic way to pretty much anything sounds really good. But what does it take to actually implement something like that? Well, how about I take you on a journey and show you all the ups and downs, misses and hits, successes and failures we went through to make physics-based enemies that not only look but also perform great in a multiplayer environment. So for those who don't know, we're making a game called Bot Blasters, a physics-based FPS game where you fight against evil robots. One of the biggest goals for this game was to have enemies that behave as realistic as possible. This includes things like dynamic leg placement, keeping their balance, being able to react to different forces like explosions, or having their legs blown off and adjusting themselves accordingly. You know, basic stuff. When we first started working on the game, I had no idea how we're gonna achieve this. But I knew the first step would probably be to just simply have an enemy, implement some basic movement code combined with procedural animations and see how it looks. To achieve this, you would normally use something called humanoid instances. In Roblox, humanoid instance is what turns inanimate objects in the game into living entities. It gives objects properties like name, health, movement speed, and bunch of other stuff. Generally, humanoids are a great way to make NPCs, for example. So it only seemed obvious to make enemies using humanoids. So for the first enemy, that's exactly what I did. And the result was actually pretty good. So good in fact that I thought maybe this isn't going to be so difficult. Maybe, well, I don't think I need to tell you that this approach started falling apart very quickly. The problem with humanoids is that they are very restrictive. For example, their movement is very rigid, they like to stay upright all the time, they hate being rotated in any way, and the biggest problem of all, physics. For some reason, physics works completely differently on humanoids than on the rest of the objects in the game. Now, I'm not saying using humanoids is bad, it's just that their behavior doesn't fit our game. Instead of having enemies that move like this, we wanted them to move more like this. Instead of being rigid like this, we wanted them to be more like this. Now, some of these annoying things about humanoids can be fixed if you're clever, but it still won't fix the issue with the physics. Basically, if you apply a force to a simple part, it looks like this. But if you apply the same force to a humanoid object, it just abruptly stops. Again, I have no idea why, but from my experience, humanoids just hate physics. And quite frankly, I hate them too, so f*** them. So humanoids were out of the question and I was back to square one. I was a little disappointed at first, but if you remember, I showed you these two examples of how we would like the enemies to behave, and fortunately, there is something that already has a very similar behavior. Cars. See, cars kind of have all the properties I was looking for. They can drive, steer, crash, and unlike humanoids, they have a very healthy relationship with physics. Not only that, but I also remembered seeing a bunch of videos on YouTube where people were making custom car physics using raycasting, where instead of making cars using the in-engine mechanical constraints, you would simulate all the forces necessary in code, apparently giving you more control over how the car behaves. This piqued my interest, but how exactly does this translate into our game? Well, my idea was to take the behavior of a car, put it on a simple part so it behaves like a car, and then put an enemy on top of this part, and in theory, the enemy should now behave way more realistically. To do this, however, I first had to somehow simulate a car. Of course, this was way beyond my knowledge, so first I started researching how cars work, and I found this resource online that seemed to talk about everything, like braking, engine force, gear ratios, the chicken and the egg. What? Okay, to be honest, all this information was way more difficult than it should have been, because from what I found, I only needed to simulate one thing. Suspension. Suspension system is what makes cars comfortable to riding, but for our purposes we only needed to make the car look like it's standing on wheels. For that we needed to simulate only one component of the suspension system, and that is springs. Simulating springs is surprisingly very simple. All you need is this one equation called Hooke's law, law, where K is the stiffness of the spring, X is the displacement of the spring, and you get a spring force. So to test this out, I created this very simple car, put 4 parts in each corner where the springs will be, called ray parts. Then I put vector force constraints in each of them. Then in the code I simply iterate through all of those ray parts. I cast a ray downwards. I get a displacement by subtracting the current ray length from the resting distance of the spring. Then I calculate the suspension force using Hooke's law. I update the vector forces, and this is the result. Okay, so this has 2 problems. First, the car keeps bouncing. Second, it doesn't stop moving. Both problems exist because we are missing one crucial thing: friction. Now, friction is basically a force that acts in the opposite direction of the motion force and causes objects to eventually stop moving. So, to make this work fully, we have to implement friction on both the springs and the wheels themselves. Friction on a spring is usually called damping, which has a very simple equation where P is a damping coefficient and V is the velocity. Implementing this formula is as simple as calculating the spring velocity and adding this formula into our existing equation. Now, the car no longer jumps up and down, that's great, but the wheels still have no friction. From what I have found, there is multiple types of frictions, but from my observations, I was pretty sure that I only needed the sliding friction. So, if I have a car, and let's say the car is trying to turn to the left, we know this is the direction the wheels want to go, this is the direction the wheels are sliding in, then we need to apply a force in the opposite direction to negate the sliding. For this, we can use the well-known formula for calculating a force, where we multiply a mass of an object by the acceleration. In the code, we already know the mass, but to get the acceleration, we simply get the steer direction, steer velocity, changing that velocity in the opposite direction, and use this formula to get the final sliding force. Doing this will give us a fully functioning car that can both drive and steer without actually having wheels. I was really happy with the result as it behaved exactly how I want it, but I still did some more testing because remember, this is a multiplayer game, so it not only has to work, but it also cannot create huge network performance issues. Which is exactly what it did. So, if I open the performance stats, you can see the amount of data being sent over the network that you are receiving, and when it's orange like this, it means the network bandwidth is completely clogged up. Now, this is where things went from really good to f***ing nuclear in seconds. Basically, the entire logic of our car is very intense. All of this is running 4 times every frame because we have 4 wheels, and that's only one car. If I expand this to 2, 3 or 4 cars, the game becomes completely unplayable. How amazing! I was very defeated by this discovery because it not only meant that all this time and effort I put into making this was for nothing because I couldn't use it in the game, but it also meant that I had to find a different solution. Now, this is where the development of our game entered what I would call the uncanny valley period. Because at the time, I couldn't come up with any other solution that would look great and also wouldn't cause any performance issues other than, and now brace yourselves, using physical car chases instead of a simulated one. Yes, exactly, for quite some time, behind the scenes, this is how enemies looked and functioned in our game. Now, I'm not gonna explain this system in detail because, first of all, it had many problems, and also I don't want anyone to even remotely think this is a good idea and that they should try it, but there is so much I could make an entire video about this system. So if you're interested, let me know. But basically, I got so fed up with this system that I eventually went back to the previous system that didn't work, and I just tried to somehow make it work against all odds. This time, however, I saw things much clearer, and I realized that this system didn't work because it was bad or the code was bad. No, it didn't work because I'm stupid. I was so focused on trying to simulate a car system that I completely missed the simpler solution. Up until this point, I was using 4 raycasts for each wheel to make the car balanced, but at the end of the day, I'm making enemies, not cars. So if you really think about it, you only need 1 raycast in the middle. Of course, if we do this, the car loses balance, but that's easily fixable by adding a line orientation constraint on it, along with linear velocity to make the car move without the need of us calculating the forces, which means we can simplify the code from 4 iterations per frame to just 1. Now, the result won't be as fluid and as good as it was before, but we can achieve pretty much the same thing by adding this function from my very first attempts to calculate the correct orientation of the car. This gives the enemies a very realistic feel while also being very easy to modify for various types of enemies, and most importantly, it's very optimized. It runs like 10 times better than what I had before. But anyway, I hope you learned something new, and I highly recommend watching my previous video where I talk about other optimizations we did for our game. And I guess the moral of the story is sometimes a difficult problem has a very simple solution.